Welcome, everyone. I'm truly grateful you've joined us tonight. As you settle in, let the calm stories under the stars and the soft tunes of the moon embrace your heart. Take a deep, soothing breath and allow the quiet magic of voice to guide you gently toward peaceful dreams. If you enjoy these moments of relaxation, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps keep the stories flowing. Now let's begin, where every word is meant to calm and comfort. The autumn of 1917 in France was a time of bitter wind and even colder hearts. In the muddy fields near the front lines, where the earth was churned by artillery and the sky was perpetually gray with smoke, a young soldier named Thomas found solace only in the memory of gentle words and soft promises. Amid the chaos of war, he clung to the letters he penned in stolen moments of quiet, letters addressed to Clara, a nurse whose compassion had given him hope amid despair. Thomas had been just 19 when he first met Clara in a field hospital. She moved among the wounded with an almost otherworldly grace, her gentle hands tending to scars both visible and hidden. In the midst of pain and blood, her smile was a beacon of light. For Thomas, who had known only the brutal realities of trench warfare, her kindness was like a soft lullaby that promised a life beyond the carnage. He began writing letters whenever a quiet moment allowed, scribbling dreams of a future together, of marriage and peace. He promised her that when the war ended, they would be free to build a life far from the ravages of battle. Clara, too, had felt an unexpected stirring in her heart. Though she had seen many soldiers come and go, Thomas's letters stood apart. They were tender, earnest, and filled with the hope of a future that seemed as distant as the stars in the night sky. Every time she read his neat, looping script on a faded piece of paper, she would clutch the locket Thomas had given her, a small token he'd pressed into her palm the day before he left for the front. In that locket, she carried both his promise and her own fragile hope that love would conquer the darkness of war. For months, the letters flowed between the trenches and the hospital in a secret exchange. Thomas's words were full of life's simple promises: a small cottage in the countryside, a garden bursting with wildflowers, and evenings spent listening to Clara's soft laughter. In return, Clara wrote back with gentle reassurances, her letters filled with tender dreams and quiet encouragements. They vowed to marry when the war was over, a vow that became their lifeline, a beacon of light amid the constant uncertainty. Then, one bitterly cold night in late 1917, as Thomas huddled in the damp mud of a dugout with nothing but his worn-out uniform and a heart full of longing, a telegram arrived at the field hospital. In a curt, impersonal script, the message read, "Missing in action." Thomas never received it himself. The telegram was delivered to the nurses as a grim official notice, a decree that his fate was unknown. When Clara received the telegram, her world cracked open. The words were like a death knell, echoing across the silent corridors of her heart. In that moment, Clara made a silent vow. She would keep Thomas alive in memory, in her heart, and in every whispered prayer as she tended to the wounded. Every day afterward, Clara wore the locket Thomas had given her, a constant reminder of the love they shared and the promises they'd made. Even as the war dragged on and the hope of reunion seemed to fade like the last embers of a once roaring fire, she clung to that tiny piece of metal, a symbol of love that defied even the harshest telegram. And though the telegram had sealed his fate as missing, Clara refused to believe that their love would end in silence. Years passed. The war eventually ended, leaving behind a scarred landscape and hearts forever changed by loss and sacrifice. Clara, now back in England, rebuilt her life around the memories of those tender promises. Every evening, she would sit by the window of her modest home, the locket resting against her heart, waiting for a sign that Thomas had returned. Friends urged her to move on, to let the pain recede like the tide. But Clara, whose soul had been intertwined with Thomas's in the midst of chaos, could not bear the thought of forgetting him. She kept his letters, each one a piece of the past that shimmered with hope, and she wore the locket as both a comfort and a promise to herself that love would find a way. Then, nearly a decade later, on a gray, drizzly morning in the spring of 1927, there was a knock at her door. Clara, who had grown accustomed to the quiet routine of her solitary life, was startled by the unexpected sound. She opened the door to find a gaunt man standing on her doorstep. His eyes, dark and deep, held a haunting familiarity, so much so that Clara's breath caught in her throat. In that moment, she could see in his expression the echo of a promise long delayed. The man could not speak. He was mute, a broken soul, silenced by the horrors of war. His hands trembled slightly, and his face was etched with scars that told of battles fought both on the fields of France and within the recesses of his own haunted mind. And yet, when he looked at Clara, there was an unmistakable warmth, a quiet pleading that reached out from beyond the years of separation. Clara recognized those eyes immediately. They were the eyes of Thomas. The realization sent a shockwave through her heart. She took a tentative step forward, her hand reaching out as if to bridge the chasm of years between them. In that fragile silence, she recalled every word of his letters, every promise etched in her memory. She recalled the day he had given her the locket, the soft murmur of vows whispered amid the din of war. Now, facing a man who bore his eyes, but not his voice, Clara felt an overwhelming mix of joy, sorrow, and bewilderment. Over the next few days, Clara devoted herself to tending to the mysterious visitor. She brought him warm tea and tried to comfort him as best as she could, her gentle words and soft touch of balm for his shattered spirit. In quiet moments, she would sit with him, watching as he stared out at the gray, rain-slicked streets of their small village, a silent sentinel lost in memories too painful to name. And slowly, day by day, she began to relearn him like a forgotten language, piecing together the man she had once known from the subtle cues in his expression and the tremors in his hands. Her neighbors whispered that he was a ghost, an echo of a promise that time had long since abandoned. But Clara knew in her heart that this gaunt figure, silent and scarred, was Thomas returned. He was not the vibrant young man who had penned passionate letters in the muddy trenches. He was a broken soul, a man transformed by the relentless cruelty of war. His silence was not born of indifference, but of a deep, unspoken agony, a silence that spoke of memories too painful to articulate. One evening, as a pale autumn sunset filtered through the clouds, Clara sat with Thomas by the crackling fireplace in her modest sitting room. The room was filled with the muted scent of burning wood and the soft, steady tick of an old clock on the mantel. For hours she spoke to him, stories of the letters he had written, the promises they had made, and the dreams they had once nurtured. Thomas listened, his eyes reflecting a tumult of emotions. Though he could not answer with words, his gaze and subtle gestures spoke volumes. Then came the day that Clara had both dreaded and longed for, the day of their long postponed wedding. In the small, ivy-clad chapel on the outskirts of the village, preparations were made for a union that was as symbolic as it was bittersweet. Only a handful of close friends attended, those who had witnessed Clara's unwavering hope over the years, and who knew the secret history of love and loss that bound her to Thomas. As Clara walked down the aisle, her heart trembled with a mixture of apprehension and joy. The chapel, modest and filled with the quiet hum of prayer, bore witness to a love that had survived the ravages of war and time. In the simple ceremony, with its few words and the soft murmur of a hymn, Thomas stood at the altar. He was not the confident, loquacious man of old. Instead, he was gaunt, his eyes haunted by the ghosts of battles fought long ago. His silence a constant reminder of the toll that war had taken on him. When the vows were exchanged, a hush fell over the small assembly, and Clara stepped forward to place a gentle kiss upon Thomas's scarred cheek. Her voice, soft but filled with a lifetime of emotion, broke the silence that had defined their reunion for so long. "Thomas," she whispered, her eyes glistening with tears that held both forgiveness and a fierce joy. "You're late, but you're here." In that tender moment, as the candlelight flickered and the old clock ticked steadily, something miraculous happened. For the first time since their fateful separation, Thomas's eyes, filled with unspoken sorrow and deep affection, glimmered with the promise of renewal. With trembling hands and a quiet determination born of years in silence, he leaned toward Clara, and in a voice that was barely audible over the hush of the chapel, he whispered a single word: "Clara." The word, simple and full of meaning, broke through the years of silence and heartache. It was as if the very air had shifted, carrying with it the echoes of a promise fulfilled at long last. The congregation, though few, felt the magnitude of that moment. Here, in this modest chapel, two souls, scarred by war and time, had finally found their way back to each other. Their love, though battered and incomplete, shone with a fierce, resilient light, a light that had waited patiently through the darkest of nights. After the ceremony, as the newlyweds stepped out into the soft light of a waning afternoon, Clara clutched Thomas's hand tightly. Together, they walked slowly down the worn stone steps of the chapel, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. The world around them was unchanged, a quiet village in England where life had carried on despite the scars of a great war. But in their hearts, everything had shifted. They were bound by a love that had survived separation and loss, a love that had been tempered by pain, yet remained unbroken. Next story. The early morning light of Boston in 1908 was soft and tentative, as if the city itself were slowly waking from a long slumber. George Whitman, the modest and shy librarian at the Boston Athenaeum, arrived each day with quiet determination. A man of few words, George found solace amid the dusty shelves and the gentle rustle of pages. His days were measured by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the reading room and by the whispered sound of footsteps on worn wooden floors. Every Thursday, without fail, a singular figure captured his attention, a woman with an air of quiet mystery who always chose the same corner of the library to read. Clad in a modest dress with a soft, flowing scarf, Rose appeared as though she belonged to another era. Each Thursday afternoon, she settled into the worn armchair near the window, the golden light of autumn streaming over her delicate features. In her hands, she held a well-thumbed copy of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, its cover faded and pages creased by repeated readings. To George, her presence was like a secret melody that he longed to understand, even as his heart pounded with a mix of admiration and fear. For months, George had watched silently as Rose lost herself in the world of Thornfield Hall and its passionate heroine. He noticed how her eyes would light up during the most stirring passages, and how a faint smile sometimes played upon her lips as she read. Yet she remained distant, a quiet figure lost in the poetry of another time. So deeply was George's affection for her that every Thursday he found himself looking for any sign that she might notice him. But shy by nature and painfully self-conscious, he never dared approach her. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a delicate impulse stirred within him, a longing to leave behind a small trace of his own. That day, as Rose once again settled into her familiar chair with Jane Eyre, George carefully retrieved a small, pressed forget-me-not from his own modest collection of wildflowers he'd tended in his tiny garden behind the library. With trembling hands and a heart pounding like a secret drum, he slipped the tiny blue blossom between the pages of her book, carefully tucking it between the chapter on Jane's first encounter with Mr. Rochester and the passage describing the vast, mysterious moors. It was a silent offering, a bookmark imbued with hope and the longing to be remembered. For weeks thereafter, Thursday after Thursday, the ritual repeated. Rose always arrived, and George would discreetly slip a pressed forget-me-not into the margins of her beloved book. He never saw her react. She read, she turned pages, and she never mentioned the flower. Yet the silent presence of the bloom seemed to add a fragile luminescence to her reading. George's heart fluttered every time he thought of her finding his small token, though he never dared to imagine that she might know who had left it. Then one Thursday, as a late November rain tapped gently against the tall, arched windows of the library, something unexpected happened. George arrived early, as usual, and began his routine check of the shelves in reading room. Near the corner where Rose usually sat, he noticed that her copy of Jane Eyre lay upon the table, the pages carefully closed. Curiosity urging him on, he walked over and gently opened the book. There, in the exact place where he had always placed his forget-me-not, instead of the delicate blue bloom he knew so well, was a neatly folded note. His fingers shook as he unfolded the paper, revealing in elegant handwriting a single, unexpected message. Mr. Eyre is a fool. A woman who loves flowers deserves more than attic ghosts. R. George's breath caught in his throat. The note was both puzzling and provocative. Who was R? And what did the reference to Mr. Eyre mean? For a long, silent moment, he sat there, the note clutched tightly in his hand, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Had Rose discovered his token and decided to respond in kind? Or was this message meant for someone else entirely? The ambiguity of the message stung him, each word a double-edged dagger slicing through the delicate hope he had nurtured for so many weeks. For days after that Thursday, George found himself oscillating between despair and determination. He wondered if he had misinterpreted her silence all along. Had his quiet offering been seen as an intrusion, or worse, as a pitiful gesture from a man unworthy of a woman like Rose? The note's cutting criticism of Mr. Eyre was peculiar too. In the context of Jane Eyre, it seemed to mock the romantic hero, suggesting that the ideals of that era, of a brooding gentleman haunted by ghosts in an attic, were inadequate for a woman who truly loved flowers, who valued the beauty of life over ghostly pretense. At night, in his small room above the library, George would pace the creaking floorboards, the note clutched tightly in his hand. He replayed the day in his mind, trying to discern any sign of her expression, any subtle hint that might reveal what she thought of his silent overtures. But Rose remained an enigma, a silent muse who seemed as unreachable as the stars over Boston. Then, as if driven by a longing he could no longer contain, George decided that the following Thursday he would not remain silent. With a careful determination, he spent the entire weekend preparing. In the small garden behind the library, he selected a single perfect daisy, a flower that to him symbolized both hope and renewal. It was not as delicate as his usual forget-me-not, but it was sincere, simple, and spoke of a fresh beginning. On the morning of the next Thursday, with his heart trembling and palms damp with anticipation, he waited near the reading room. As the library's heavy doors swung open and the first rays of sunlight filtered into the hallowed space of books and quiet voices, Rose arrived. She was dressed in a modest, pale dress, her hair loosely tied with a ribbon, and in her hands was her cherished copy of Jane Eyre. George's heart pounded as he discreetly followed her with his eyes, careful not to be noticed. When she settled into her usual armchair, he moved with deliberate care to her table. With trembling hands, he gently slipped the daisy into the pages of her book in the same cherished spot where the forget-me-not had once rested. For the rest of the day, George hovered near the periphery of the library, his eyes constantly drifting to the table where Rose sat. He longed to see any sign, a slight smile, a nod, even a glance, that would let him know his gesture had been understood. Yet as the day wore on, she seemed absorbed in her reading, as if the daisy were as natural a part of the book as its printed words. That evening, after closing time, George sat alone in the quiet of his office, replaying every moment of the day. He considered the possibility that he might never know her thoughts. Perhaps her silence was not one of dismissal, but of contemplation, an interior world of emotions and memories, too complex for a simple word or a single gesture. And so, with a heavy heart, yet a glimmer of hope, he resolved to continue his quiet tradition, unsure of whether his small tokens would ever bridge the gap between two solitary souls. Over the following weeks, the routine continued, each Thursday a mixture of hope and apprehension. George found himself growing more attuned to the subtle rhythms of the library, watching with quiet fascination as Rose read and occasionally closed her book with a thoughtful look. Sometimes she would glance toward the door, as if expecting someone, and sometimes she would pause in her reading, lost in reverie, but she never spoke of the flowers, never acknowledged the tokens George left behind. In the silence of those Thursdays, George's imagination ran wild. He began to pen little notes in a leather-bound journal, a record of his own secret life, his hopes, his doubts, and his dreams of one day learning the true meaning behind Rose's silence. In his journal, He wrote of the delicate interplay between literature and life, of the way the pages of Jane Eyre seemed to mirror his own hidden longing for connection. He noted, with bittersweet clarity, that a woman who spent her hours with the ghosts of an attic and the passions of a bygone age might well be touched by more than mere tokens of affection. And yet, he wondered if perhaps his simple gestures, the pressed forget-me-not and the daisy, were not enough to breach the wall of mystery that surrounded her. As autumn deepened into winter, the Boston skies grew gray, and the chill wind swept along the cobblestone streets. The library, a warm haven of light and sound, offered some respite from the cold. Inside, the quiet murmur of readers and the rustle of turning pages created a world removed from the biting chill outside. It was in this world that George and Rose continued their silent exchange, a delicate dance of symbols and unsaid words. One particularly cold Thursday, as a bitter wind rattled the window panes, George found the library unusually empty. Most of the regular patrons had taken refuge in the warmth of their homes, leaving only a few solitary figures among the stacks. Yet there, in her familiar corner by the window, sat Rose, her eyes intently fixed on the pages of Jane Eyre. Summoning every ounce of courage he possessed, George approached her table. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he placed a small, neatly folded note next to the daisy in her book. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The ticking of the clock, the quiet whisper of the wind, and the steady beat of his heart all converged into a single, fragile instant. Rose lifted her eyes, startled by the sudden intrusion of a note amidst her reading. She unfolded the paper with delicate fingers, and in the faint light of the oil lamp, read the handwritten words. For a heartbeat, George thought he might have overstepped the boundary of silence. But then her eyes softened, and she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, a smile that spoke of understanding, of a secret shared between two lonely souls. That evening, as George closed up the library, he lingered by the door, peering out into the wintry darkness. He longed for a sign, a word, a gesture, anything that might reveal what Rose had truly thought of his note and the flowers he left behind. Yet the night remained silent, and he returned to his small room above the library, his heart a tangled mess of hope and uncertainty. In the days that followed, life at the Athenaeum continued in its steady, unhurried fashion. Patrons came and went, the books whispered their timeless secrets, and George resumed his daily routine. But his thoughts, like the falling leaves outside, were scattered and restless, forever returning to that quiet exchange with Rose. He recalled the note he had once found, hidden among the pages, the note that had read, "Mr. Eyre is a fool. A woman who loves flowers deserves more than attic ghosts." Oh. Those words had resonated with him deeply, hinting at a rebellious heart, a soul unafraid to dismiss the outdated romantic ideals of a brooding gentleman. And now, with the daisy he had left in its stead, he wondered if perhaps Rose's true self was waiting to be discovered, a self as vibrant and genuine as the fresh bloom of spring. As winter began to loosen its icy grip, and early hints of thaw emerged in the gray Boston mornings, George resolved to continue his quiet mission. Every Thursday, he would leave a small token in Rose's book, a pressed flower, a carefully chosen note, sometimes even a single word scribbled in neat handwriting. And every Thursday, he would watch from a distance, yearning for a glimpse of her reaction, for any sign that his silent language was being understood. Then, one mild Thursday morning, fate took an unexpected turn. The library was busier than usual, a rare, bustling morning filled with the chatter of scholars and the rustle of newspapers. Amid the crowd, George's eyes sought out his solitary muse. In the far corner of the reading room, he saw Rose, her familiar figure immersed in the pages of Jane Eyre. But this time, something was different. As she turned a page, her eyes flickered toward him, and for a brief moment, their gazes met. In that charged instant, George felt as if the silent barriers between them had shifted imperceptibly, a subtle acknowledgement of the secret exchange they had been sharing for weeks. After the rush subsided and the library's patrons began to disperse, George found himself standing near the circulation desk. His heart pounded with a mix of hope and trepidation. Would she speak to him? Would she, perhaps timidly, ask about the tokens he left behind? But as the minutes ticked by, Rose gathered her belongings and left in her customary quiet manner, leaving George to wonder if that fleeting moment had meant anything at all. That evening, while locking the library's heavy door behind him, George's mind churned with questions. He recalled every detail of the day, the brief moment of eye contact, the gentle curve of her smile, the way her eyes seemed to shine with a secret light. In the solitude of his small room, he turned the events over and over in his mind, questioning whether his silent language had finally begun to speak to her. He resolved that the coming Thursday he would bring forth a token of his own, a simple, honest gesture that might finally bridge the gap between them. On that anticipated Thursday, as dawn broke over Boston with a promise of renewal, George awoke with trembling hands and a racing heart. In his modest room, he carefully selected a single, bright daisy from the small vase on his windowsill, a flower that symbolized both hope and innocence. With deliberate care, he placed the daisy into an envelope, along with a short, handwritten note. May these petals remind you that beauty is found in small kindnesses. He then slipped the envelope into the pages of Jane Eyre, precisely where he had left the forget-me-not, and later the daisy. Every detail, he hoped, would speak of his sincere admiration and longing. That morning at the library, as the heavy oak doors swung open and the first visitors began to trickle in, George's heart pounded with anticipation. He hid his face behind a stack of returned books, watching intently as Rose entered the reading room. She made her way to her usual corner, and with slow, measured steps, settled into her armchair. George's eyes followed her every movement until, at last, she reached for Jane Eyre. With a cautious motion, she opened the book, and there, nestled among its cherished pages, lay his daisy and note. For several long moments, Rose stared at the delicate flower and read the note over and over, as if trying to decode its hidden meaning. A subtle change came over her face, a softening of expression that to George was a silent smile. Though she offered no verbal acknowledgement, her eyes shimmered with a gentle understanding. In that fleeting exchange, George felt that perhaps at last his quiet language was being received. In the weeks that followed, Rose continued to come every Thursday, reading Jane Eyre in her familiar corner, and George, with renewed hope, continued to leave his small tokens. Sometimes it was a daisy, other times a pressed wildflower or a short, poetic note scribbled in neat, looping script. Each token was a humble offering, a bookmark of sorts, meant to bridge the gap between two solitary hearts. And although their encounters remained silent, a gentle camaraderie began to weave itself between them, a tapestry of shared moments and unspoken words. One winter afternoon, a curious change occurred. Rose, usually so reserved, lingered a moment longer after her reading. With a determined look, she stepped away from her chair and walked slowly toward the circulation desk, where George had been shelving returned books. The soft clatter of her footsteps echoed in the near-empty room, and George, startled from his work, looked up to see her approaching. For a long, silent moment, they simply regarded each other. In the quiet of that snowbound afternoon, amid the soft glow of the library's lamplight, the fragile barrier of shyness began to crumble. With a gentle, tentative smile, Rose reached out and in a voice barely above a whisper said, "I have come to thank you for your kindness." Her eyes searched his with a mixture of curiosity and quiet resolve. I have always loved flowers and the beauty they hold in the simplest gestures. And your tokens, they have brought a light into my days that I never expected. George's heart swelled with a mix of relief and joy. For so long he had feared that his silent gestures might be misinterpreted, that his hopes might be lost in the anonymity of the pages. Now, with Rose's gentle confession, the distance between them seemed to vanish like morning mist. He began, but then found his voice soft and earnest. "I have long admired you from afar, and I hoped that in leaving these little tokens, you might feel that you are not alone." In that simple exchange, amid the quiet stacks of books and the soft murmur of falling snow, a tentative promise was made, a promise of future conversation and shared moments. Over the weeks, as Boston's winter gave way to the tentative blush of early spring, George and Rose began to meet in quiet corners of the library. Their first conversation was halting, filled with pauses and shy smiles, but it soon deepened into long discussions about literature, art, and the beauty of small kindnesses. They spoke of Jane Eyre, its passionate heroine, and the timeless struggle between duty and desire, and of the power that a single flower might have to transform a day. For George, each conversation with Rose was like the unfolding of a rare manuscript. For Rose, the timid librarian represented a bridge to a gentler world, one where beauty and tenderness were not lost amid the ghosts of the past. Together, they explored the corridors of the library, discovered hidden corners filled with forgotten lore, and in quiet moments, shared dreams that had long been buried beneath layers of loneliness. As spring blossomed fully over Boston, with cherry trees lining the avenues and the city coming alive with new hope, the small tokens that once existed only as anonymous offerings evolved into a language of love. Rose would often tuck a pressed flower, sometimes a daisy, into the pages of a book that George left on the circulation desk, a subtle echo of his own earlier gestures. And every Thursday, as the clock in the reading room chimed softly, both knew that a silent promise was being renewed with each token exchanged. On one Thursday, as the soft sunlight streamed through the library's tall windows and painted the floors with golden hues, George arrived with trembling hands and a heart full of cautious hope. Clutching a small bouquet of freshly picked wildflowers, he awaited Rose's arrival with a mix of anticipation and genial anxiety. When she entered the reading room that day, her eyes immediately lit up as she noticed the bouquet placed beside a copy of Jane Eyre on her usual table. Without a word, she delicately removed one flower, a small, fragrant bloom, and pressed it into her diary as if preserving it for a cherished memory. That evening, as the library slowly emptied and the echoes of the day faded into quiet whispers, George and Rose sat together near the back of the room. Their conversation flowed easily now, punctuated by laughter and moments of reflective silence. In that shared space, the tokens no longer needed to speak for them. Their eyes, their smiles, and the gentle warmth of their words had taken on the language of its own. Next story. Every dawn in Paris carried a promise of renewal, a gentle light breaking over the ancient city, softening the edges of a past still marred by conflict. In a modest quarter near Montmartre, where narrow cobblestone streets whispered tales of love and loss, a small flower shop stood as a living sanctuary of color amid the gray memory of war. Its owner, Amélie Laurent, had inherited the shop after her husband's untimely death on the front lines. For years, she had tended to her blooms with a careful tenderness, though beneath her composed exterior lay an ache of loneliness and bitter pride. Unbeknownst to her, each morning before the city fully awoke, a solitary figure would make his way along the quiet streets. Lucien Dufour was a war veteran whose face bore the deep, silent scars of the trenches. Every dawn, he would pause at the doorstep of Amélie's flower shop, leaving behind a single stale baguette. It was a peculiar offering, a remnant of Parisian daily life, rendered humble and imperfect by time. At first, Amélie had assumed it was charity, a clumsy attempt by a poor soul to help. But as the days passed, the daily ritual became an unwelcome reminder of her vulnerability. Amélie's mornings had grown rigid. With each visit to her shop, she would find the same hard, crusted loaf propped against the door. The gesture, rather than comforting her, stung with a mix of pity and indignation. How dare someone presume to show kindness in such a condescending manner, she would mutter, forcing herself to shut the door on the silent delivery. In her heart, she believed that charity should come wrapped in dignity, not in the tattered remnant of a once crisp baguette. And so, though her fingers trembled as she locked up each evening, she harbored a quiet resentment toward the mysterious benefactor who returned every day without fail. For Lucien, however, the act was far removed from charity. Each morning, as the first pale light stretched across the Parisian rooftops, he retrieved his worn-out loaf from a battered cloth bag and set off on his quiet pilgrimage. Lucien's life had been upended by the war. The scars etched across his face were not merely physical, but spoke of deep emotional wounds, a legacy of nights spent in the mud and blood of battle, and days haunted by memories too painful to forget. Yet amid the darkness of those memories, there had been something that had sustained him, a glimpse of light in the form of delicate red roses. In the hellish cacophony of war, the image of those roses had been an oasis of beauty, a reminder that even in the midst of destruction, there could be moments of grace. And so it was that every morning, as he passed the bustling markets and narrow alleyways, Lucien's steps would carry him to the flower shop. There, in the quiet shadow of the early sun, he would leave a stale baguette on the doorstep, a humble token of gratitude for the roses that had, in his darkest moments, made the trenches seem a little less bleak. He did not expect recognition. In fact, he took great pains to hide his identity. Beneath a tattered cap, and a scarf pulled low over his scarred face. He moved like a ghost, present only for the moment it took to leave his silent offering before slipping away into the Parisian morning. For months, this ritual continued in the silence. Amélie, preoccupied with the delicate art of arranging her blossoms and the tedious demands of running a business in a recovering city, never confronted the mystery. Yet within her, conflicting emotions began to stir. The daily appearance of the stale bread, a symbol of something she could not quite place, started to weigh upon her thoughts. Was it a sneer, a condescension, or perhaps a misguided gesture of pity? She found herself debating with her own pride in the quiet hours of the morning, the answer eluding her as persistently as the man who delivered it. One crisp winter morning, when Paris was still shrouded in a light frost, and the sky wore a clear, pale blue, fate intervened. Amélie had arrived at her shop earlier than usual, determined to open before the city fully stirred. As she was arranging freshly cut peonies and dahlias, she caught a glimpse of movement at her door. Expecting one of her regular customers, she turned sharply, but instead, she saw a pair of cautious eyes peering around the corner of the doorframe. The man's face was partially hidden by the brim of a cap and the shadow of a scarf, yet something about his guarded expression made her heart beat faster. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm yet laced with uncertainty. The figure hesitated, then slowly stepped into the soft glow of the shop's interior. Lucien's eyes, hidden behind layers of fatigue and war-worn sorrow, met hers. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. Amélie's eyes narrowed in shock as she took in the sight of the man whose daily offering she had loathed, the very same man whose hands she imagined to be rough. But now, as he stood before her, his face was a mosaic of hidden scars and unspoken pain. The hardened exterior softened for a moment, revealing a vulnerability that belied his silent act. With a deep, trembling breath, Lucien spoke. "Ma'am, I beg your pardon for intruding," he said, his voice low and measured. His eyes, dark and sincere, searched hers as if seeking absolution. "The bread, it's not for pity." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor as if weighing each word carefully. Then his voice grew softer, laden with memories too heavy for simple conversation. "Your roses, they made the trenches feel less dark." Time seemed to stretch out in that delicate moment. Amélie felt her heart lurch, a mix of astonishment and something else, something fragile and unexpected. The confession, spoken in a quiet murmur, resonated with an authenticity that shattered the cold distance of her resentment. Slowly, her anger melted into a sorrowful understanding. She had always believed that the gesture was one of condescension, but now it became painfully clear that it was an offering of gratitude, a desperate attempt by a wounded soul to acknowledge the small beauty that had helped him survive the horrors of war. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the city awakening beyond the shop's windows, and the soft rustle of fabric as Lucien shifted his weight. Finally, Amélie, whose throat felt tight with unspoken emotion, stepped forward. I don't understand," she stammered. "Why would you leave a stale baguette?" Lucien's eyes glistened with an emotion that bordered on tears. "It is all I could give," he said quietly. "I have nothing left but memories, and memories, madame, are as fragile as bread left out in the cold. But your roses, when I saw them, amidst the ruin of the trenches, they gave me hope. They reminded me that beauty could still exist, even where death had reigned." The intensity of his words struck Amelie like a wave. In that moment, the stale baguette she had despised transformed in her eyes. It was no longer a symbol of pity or charity. It was a token of gratitude, a silent thank you from a man whose life had been forever altered by war. As if compelled by an inner urging she could not resist, Amelie reached out and gently took the baguette from Lucien's outstretched hand. With deliberate care, she broke the crust, revealing the soft interior. The act was intimate, a sharing of something raw and honest. Their eyes met once more, and though no further words were exchanged, an understanding passed between them, a silent accord that both bore the marks of sacrifice and hidden grace. Before Lucien could retreat into the anonymity he had so long embraced, Amelie, with trembling fingers, tore a small piece of the bread and pressed it into his hand. Then, as if in a final tender gesture, she plucked a single crimson petal from a cluster of roses arranged in a vase on the counter. With care that belied her earlier anger, she tucked the petal into the pocket of his worn coat. Lucien's eyes widened, and a soft smile, fragile as a new blossom, curved his lips. "Merci," he whispered, the word laden with more than simple gratitude. It was a benediction for both of them. Merci for understanding. From that day onward, the daily ritual transformed. The once daily stale baguette left in quiet anonymity became a bridge between two wounded souls. Every dawn, Lucien still made his pilgrimage to the flower shop, leaving behind his token of remembrance. And each day, as the soft light of morning filtered through the misty Parisian streets, Amelie would greet him with a nod or a brief, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, unspoken understanding. In the weeks that followed, their paths began to intertwine in small, unexpected ways. Sometimes, as Amelie arranged bouquets at her shop, she would catch sight of Lucien in the early light, leaning against a lamppost outside, or pausing by the market stalls to purchase a modest bouquet of wildflowers. Other times, he would linger near the shop's doorway, his gaze fixed on the roses, as if trying to memorize every petal, every hue. Their encounters were brief, wordless exchanges that grew into a quiet ritual of mutual solace, a way for each to acknowledge the other's presence in a world that had known too much loss. Amelie, once resolute in her solitary grief, found herself slowly opening up to the possibility that kindness could be more than a reminder of sorrow. In the late afternoons, when the golden light of the Paris sun softened the sharp edges of the day, she would sometimes invite Lucien inside for a cup of weak coffee or tea. They would sit by the window that overlooked the bustling street, sharing stories of memories both bitter and sweet. Lucien spoke little of the war, only hinting at the horrors he had witnessed and the way those days had forever altered his heart. Instead, he focused on small details, how the scent of roses had reminded him of a rare moment of beauty amid the chaos, how the soft crumb of a baguette had become a symbol of hope in a landscape of despair. For Amelie, these moments were transformative. In Lucien's quiet, unassuming manner, she saw a reflection of her own resilience, a determination to find beauty and meaning in the smallest gestures. His eyes, though scarred by the past, held a gentle warmth that slowly melted the hard edges of her loneliness. And as the days turned into weeks, the resentment she had once felt for the mysterious offerings dissipated, replaced by a tender curiosity about the man behind the scarred visage. There were evenings when Paris itself seemed to join in their quiet communion. The city, recovering from the ravages of war, had a way of celebrating life in its own understated manner. In the narrow lanes of Montmartre, where art and passion still danced in the flickering light of street lamps, the air was filled with both nostalgia and a promise of renewal. It was during one such evening, when the skies were brushed with hues of lavender and the distant strains of an accordion floated through the air, that Lucien and Amélie found themselves sharing more than just silent glances. That night, as Amélie closed her flower shop after a long day, she noticed Lucien waiting beneath the awning, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lamplights. His hands, usually hidden beneath the collar of his worn coat, were clasped tightly as if guarding a secret. With a hesitant smile, she approached him. "Bonsoir, Lucien," she greeted softly. There was a moment of stillness, a pause laden with unspoken words, before he replied, "Bonsoir, Amélie." They walked together along the cobblestone street, the rhythmic echo of their footsteps mingling with the distant murmur of the city. Under the muted glow of a street lamp, Lucien stopped and for the first time allowed his scarred face to be seen fully in the light. Amélie studied the lines that told stories of battles and nights too long, and in that vulnerable exposure she saw not a figure of pity, but a man who had endured and still hoped. Then, with a voice that trembled slightly, he spoke again. "Your roses, they gave me strength in the trenches. When I was surrounded by darkness, the thought of their red petals, of life blooming even amid despair, kept me going. I could not thank you enough." Amélie felt her own eyes well with tears, tears not only for the loss of so many, but for the quiet redemption found in the simplest acts of beauty. "And you, Lucien," she replied softly, "by leaving your bread every morning, you reminded me that even the smallest token can carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken words." In that moment, the burden of pride and past sorrows seemed to lift, replaced by the gentle understanding that their shared grief could be transmuted into hope. That night, as they paused outside a tiny cafe with its door left ajar, Amélie tore a piece from the very loaf Lucien had brought that morning and shared it with him. With deliberate care, she then plucked a single crimson petal from a rose resting in the vase at the counter and tucked it into his coat pocket. It was a small, tender act, a symbolic merging of their worlds, the humble, enduring offering of bread and the delicate, passionate beauty of a rose. Over the following months, Paris bloomed in its own way. The streets that had once echoed with the sounds of despair now rang with quiet laughter and the soft melody of life reawakened. Lucien and Amélie continued their daily exchanges. Each morning, the stale baguette, once a symbol of misunderstanding, became a token of their growing kinship, while each evening, their shared moments grew into a tapestry of gentle intimacy. In time, Lucien began to reveal more of his story. He spoke of the battles he had fought, not in detail but in fleeting memories. A childhood spent in a quiet village, the moment the world shattered into chaos, and the glimmer of hope that the sight of a single red rose had once sparked amid the horrors of war. Amélie, too, shared pieces of her past, of her late husband's warm laughter, of long summer days spent tending to their garden, and of the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from fragments of memory. Their conversations were imbued with the bittersweet flavor of remembrance, each word a soft stitch in the fabric of healing. and while they never declared any grand promises, their daily rituals became the silent testament of lives slowly intertwined. Lucien, once a solitary wanderer haunted by his scars, found solace in Amelie's steadfast presence. Amelie, whose heart had guarded itself against further loss, began to see in him not pity, but a kindred spirit, one whose wounded soul resonated with her own hidden depths. As spring gave way to summer and the gardens of Paris burst into vibrant hues, the small flower shop became a haven not just for blooms, but for quiet reconciliation. The stale baguette, now transformed by its repeated journey from Lucien's hands to the doorstep and back into shared moments inside the shop, came to symbolize the unexpected beauty born from sacrifice and vulnerability. One bright morning, with the scent of fresh pastries and blooming lilacs drifting in the air, Amelie found a note tucked between the pages of her ledger, a brief, handwritten message that simply read, "For every crumb of darkness, there is a rose waiting to bloom." The delicate script was unmistakably Lucien's. As she held the note close, her eyes misted with gratitude. It was a message that encapsulated everything they had silently communicated over those long months. A promise that even in a world scarred by loss, there existed the potential for renewal and grace. In the seasons that followed, the quiet bond between Lucien and Amelie grew stronger. Neighbors began to notice the change, a subtle lightness in Amelie's smile as she tended her roses, and a gentler set to Lucien's weary eyes whenever he passed by the shop. Though neither spoke openly of their heart's secret language, the daily rituals, the bread left at dawn, the shared morsels at twilight, the gentle exchange of tokens like the crimson petal, became the unspoken language of their mutual healing. And so it was that in the wake of a war that had shattered lives and hearts, two solitary souls in 1921, Paris discovered that even the most humble offerings could weave together the threads of hope and redemption. Lucien continued to leave his daily breadcrumb, not out of pity, but as a quiet tribute to the beauty that had once lit his darkest hours. Amelie, with each new bloom in her shop, nurtured a fragile but resilient faith in the possibility of second chances. One crisp autumn evening, as the Parisian sky blazed with the fiery hues of sunset, Lucien and Amelie found themselves standing together on the steps of the flower shop. The day had been long, filled with the bustle of the recovering city, yet in that golden moment, everything seemed to pause. Lucien's eyes, reflecting the fading light, met Amelie's with a quiet tenderness. Without a word, she reached into his coat pocket and drew out the crimson petal that had once been tucked there so carefully. In return, he offered her a small, crumpled piece of paper, a note written in the gentle, deliberate hand that had delivered his daily messages. The note read simply, "In every broken piece, there is a chance to rebuild. In every scar, a story of survival. And in every shared crumb, a promise that we are not alone." In that moment, beneath the fading glow of the autumn sun, their eyes spoke of forgiveness, of hope reborn, and of the delicate truth that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can light the way through even the deepest darkness. Thank you for spending this time with me. You deserve this moment of peace. The story may be over, but the gentle rain will keep you company a little longer. Let it wash away the worries of the day. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.